the next slide here, well, I can... You can see how this MRI, this is a sagittal plane. It will actually go right through the ear and then go across the face. You'll see the eyes come up, and then as you get into the middle, there's no eyes. Okay. You're going to know what all these brain structures are by the time we're done. Okay. This is what you're going to be more likely to see in the hospital. No, we don't want to stop there. Let's keep going. There's a reason to stop. That looks like it's right about in the midline. So you don't see the eyes. Okay, they're on either side. Brain models and plastic models and things like that don't have too much relevance in the real world, but these do. Okay? Photographs that you're going to have to label don't have all that much relevance. I wish I could test you with MRIs and CT scans. But this is a MRI. You'll see the CAT scans have a little different appearance. The MRIs give you a beautiful view of the brain. I'll go through some of the nomenclature here, and then we'll go to labeled pictures and do it again, and so you'll see the correlations here. Like I said, you'll notice you don't see the eyes. The dark spaces here, this is where you have fluid, okay? Even up and through here. It's not quite just in the midline because there's fluid around this area here. There's a canal. Let's see if I can get a little better picture of the midline. Let's see if I can get the cerebral aqueduct. If we can do that, we're right in the middle. Beautiful, right there. Okay, now let's look for this little fluid path right there. Okay, that's called the cerebral aqueduct. The larger part of the brain is called the cerebrum. Okay. And we have the cerebellum down here. You can see that it's below a membrane here. This is part of the meninges, which are the outer layers of the brain. We'll go, you're going to get all this in tonight's lab if you didn't already get it this afternoon. So don't worry, I'm going too fast here. We're going to go through all this again. That's where you get the word meningitis, right? The inflammation of the meninges, this membrane here. There's 3 different layers to that. In the lab, I'll show you how that's clinically relevant because of different types of bleeds and blood clotting problems and things like that. So, but the major part of the brain is the cerebrum and the cerebellum here. Cerebellum is, for our purposes, is mostly concerned with coordination and balance, things like that. That's why they do drunk testing. Your cerebellum is affected by alcohol along with your inner ear. So when you're doing this kind of stuff, your cerebellum isn't working, okay? And when you can't do this real well, okay, moving your finger and touching your nose, you do things like pass pointing, like that. That's a cerebellar problem. Not only for people who are intoxicated, but for people who have cerebellar degeneration and diseases, okay? That's all part of normal medical testing. You're testing their finger acuity. How many times can you do the opposition back and forth with your thumb and fingers? Your cerebellum helps you do that, in a coordinated fashion. So flip-flopping like this. People who have cerebellar disease have a hard time coordinating that, okay? And that's just part of testing for that. Interesting little structure inside the cerebellum. As you'll notice, you see this thing, it looks like a little tree. Okay? And a tree with leaves there. That's the white matter. Those are axons that are going to be going out of the cerebellum. They're collecting the little darker areas. That's gray matter. That's where the neuron bodies are. Okay? This, because it looked like a tree to the early anatomists, they called it the arbor vitae, the tree of life. Okay? Remember Arbor Day is Tree Day? Okay? Arbor vitae, the tree of life. And it has fibers coming across here. This area right here, around the area, is called the pons. Okay? It's Latin for bridge. And there's a lot of bridging neurons that come around this area, wrapping around this fluid space here. This is important because almost all the stuff, well, essentially all the stuff that the axons that are coming from your motor and your sensory strips up in this area. Okay, so every axon that's going to run down and tell the motor neuron in my my spine to move my leg, it all has to come from a certain motor strip on the brain. That's going to converge and all come down into one little area in the spinal cord. Okay, so this is a highway down here, and there's a lot of stuff passing through here. So this is a very important area, and then the cerebellum helps coordinate that action. Okay, and helps you with, like I say, your coordination and balance, things like that. Damage here, strokes here, injuries here are devastating. Okay, I'm sorry?
I said, I was just about to ask you, because a lot of stroke victims have a lot of what you're saying, symptoms.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that's why I was wondering.
Yeah. Well, if they have a big pontine stroke, they're in a really bad way. Okay, because they've essentially decapitated themselves from the rest of their body. Okay, and a pontine stroke here can cause what's called, if you live through it, it can cause what's called locked-in syndrome, and the only thing you can do is blink your eyes. Your mind is fine. All you did was damage the pons, not the brain. Okay, so this is a perfectly normal thinking and feeling person who can't do anything but blink their eyes. Okay, nasty situation. Just below that is an area called the medulla oblongata. This is where the fibers actually cross over from side to side. So everybody probably knows that the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body and vice versa. Okay. Well, this is where they cross in the medulla here. Okay. And then they travel on down, the axons travel on down the spinal cord. We'll be looking at the anatomy of the cord a little later, so you'll see what these pathways look like and where they are and that sort of thing. One of the things that sticks out at you when you see this thing is these little, it looks like sausages rolled up here. Okay. The lumpy part, the meaty part. Okay. One of these is called a gyrus. The plural is gyri. Okay. The creases, the folds in between the sausages are called, one is called a sulcus. The plural is sulci. Okay. And you have major sulci that are important, and they'll usually sort of stipulate that they'll call them a fissure. Okay. And we'll get to those in a little bit. You have the frontal lobe. Okay. The parietal lobe here, over under the parietal bone, basically. The occipital lobe back here where our visual centers are. And we'll talk more about that in lab, so I won't do too much of the functional stuff right now. This sticks out at you, all right? This white matter here, this is pure axons. Pure axons. That's why it looks whiter. Okay. The gray matter here has a lot of neuron bodies that give it a little grayer tinge. When it looks really pale like this, you can tell that it's all axons. Okay. This is a major pathway where the left half of the brain talks to the right half. These are all axons that are going side to side. So when you cut it down the middle, you just see this band. Okay. But these are actually going this way. Okay. And now you're just looking at one part of the middle of it. Okay. That's called the corpus callosum. Okay. The bend right here is called the genu, the knee. Anybody? A lot of people don't remember the word genuflect. What does that mean? I grew up a little altar boy, Catholic, ringing the bells. And genuflection is to bend the knee. So genuflection. Genu means knee. All right? That's the bend right there. The splenium is the part that's splayed out a little flatter in the back. This is actually part of the ventricle here. This is a space. They're about the size of your finger on either side of your brain, just about in the middle, where you store cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? And they're connected by a central canal to this area right here. Okay? And so fluid flows from here underneath this structure, which is called the fornix. Okay? Flows underneath there, comes out right about here, and then flows down around the thalamus. This is the thalamus, the round area here. And then it flows down this canal, down into this area called the fourth ventricle. Okay? This is the third ventricle up here. Fourth ventricle. Then it comes down here and flows out through a couple of openings. One in the middle called the foramen of Magendie. Okay? Think MM, middle, Magendie. And the lateral one is Luschka. Okay? The lateral foramen. There are two of them on either side. Okay? Or two of them, one on either side. Then the fluid is going to flow out here, and it'll go up around the cerebellum. It'll go over the tentorium here, the dura that's causing the roof there, and then it'll flow in the subarachnoid space all over the brain, okay, flowing all around. It can even flow, it'll be in front here, it'll even flow down the sides of the spinal cord, and you can even see there's a tiny little canal right there inside the middle of the spinal cord called the central canal, and you'll have fluid flowing down in there as well. Okay? So, and then it's reabsorbed by other structures up here that we'll talk about. And I'll show you some pictures where you can have problems with blockages of the fluid. Okay? The thalamus, just as a brief point of interest right now, this is the area of the brain where all your sensory information, most of it anyway, that's going to get into the cerebrum has to pass through. So all the axons from sensory nerves coming up your spinal cord will synapse in the thalamus, and then they'll send signals up to your sensory cortex in your brain. So especially if it's going to come to conscious awareness, you bang your thumb, you're aware of that. So that had to go through the thalamus and then get sent up to the sensory part of the brain. Okay? Thalamic strokes are pretty nasty because they cause a lot of problems with sensation, but they also can put you in a coma. They can just, you're just not aware. Okay? So that's an issue. This is the optic chiasm right here. This is where the optic nerve coming from both eyes crosses over in the sella turcica. Here's the sella turcica right here. Here's the pituitary gland. Okay? So you can see that tumors of the pituitary are going to affect visual pathways. There's a little stalk here that you can't really see it. There's a stalk that holds the pituitary in place here. That's called the infundibulum, okay? Otherwise known as the pituitary stalk. This area right here, this is actually, we're in the fluid space here because we can see it's dark. But if you can picture two parts of your brain like this with a little fluid space right in the middle, okay? So when you cut through, now you're going to see a layer of fluid over the top of it, but the structure is actually deeper, okay? So this area is the hypothalamus. This is the thalamus. Hypo meaning under, right? Hypothalamus. This is the thalamus. So this is important for sensation. This is important for your bodily functions, like your sensations of thirst and hunger and even blood pressure, things like that. This is a lot of unconscious control of your bodily functions, okay? Bodily systems. Back here is a structure called the choroid plexus. This is what actually makes the cerebrospinal fluid. It's composed of those ependymal cells I was telling you about, the glial cells that make the CSF. Okay? This is where they are in this structure, and some of them are up in the ventricle as well, up here, the lateral ventricle. What we don't see is a membrane that separates the two ventricles. They're very close together. It's just a thin nerve membrane that separates the two fluid compartments. So if you take a slice down the middle, one half is going to get it, the other half isn't. Okay? And it looks like we just barely missed it here. Okay? So this you can see in there, and you can see the ventricle. Right back here sits the pineal gland. Okay? Very interesting structure. It's thought that this used to be, and in some animals it still is, a third eye. Okay? It has neural structures and cells that are very similar to the optic nerve in the retina. Okay? And there are some animals, amphibians, fish, things like this, that have a third eye up on their forehead that's light sensitive and governs their circadian rhythms and things like that. Well, that's what it does in us too. Okay? This is what's responsible for your day-night rhythms and some of your hormonal rhythms and things like that, your sleep patterns. This is what makes melatonin, the thing everybody thinks is a good sleep agent. Okay? Not really, but it does affect a little bit. But the pineal gland is the gland that makes that, and it has strong connections to the optic nerve, to the optic tracts. So it's almost part of your visual system. Okay? They used to think it was the root of the soul because it was right in the middle of the brain and there was only one of them. Okay? Just below that, the canal here has a little roof. Okay? You can barely see it. It's got one little lump there, another little lump there. Well, if you got two lumps on each side, now you've got 4 lumps when you look at it in toto, okay, and you cut it in half, you're just looking at the 2. That is called the corpora quadrigemina, the 4 bodies, okay, quadrigemina, Gemini meaning twins, okay, but corpora quadrigemina. The top 2 lumps are called the superior colliculi, or one is a colliculus, okay? The superior colliculi, and the bottom two lumps, the inferior colliculi. Okay? Colliculus in Latin means hill or bump. Okay? And they form the roof of the cerebral aqueduct, which is the canal where the cerebrospinal fluid is moving down into this area. Okay? They are fairly important clinically. Some animals have them much larger, like frogs, who rely on visual reflexes and things like that to catch things. You know, a fly comes into their field of vision. It's a reflex for them to turn their head and shoot their tongue. Okay, they don't really have to think, should I go after that one or not? You know, they boom, boom, they just do it, and that's how they survive. Okay, well, the superior colliculus does the same thing with us. It's involved in visual reflexes. So when you see a bright flash of light, you can't help but look at it, and sometimes you even get motor reflex go along with it, where you get extension and reflexive movements. Okay. So that's all governed by the superior colliculus. The inferior colliculus is auditory. So when you hear a big bang, same thing happens. Okay, especially when they're startling. Okay, that's when your reflexes kick in. I guess if you're watching fireworks, you don't really have to worry about it. You know what's coming. Okay, but when something startles you, you get those reflexes, and it's the corpora quadrigemina that is attached and governs those motor movements. Okay. Let's see, there's a little area right here that, like I say, we have the optic nerve, and where it crosses over, and half the fibers go to one side of the brain, and half of the fibers go to the other side of the brain. That's called the optic chiasm, okay? And that sits right over the sella turcica, like you knew from studying the bones. Just behind that, there's a little rounded area here. There's two of them. Something called the brain boobs. Okay, it's called the mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies. Okay? They have a fair amount to do with memory and your power for immediate memory and recall, things like that. They do get degenerated in dementia and alcoholism and certain vitamin deficiencies, things like that, and it causes memory problems. This thing right here is called the fornix. It's actually axons that are traveling. Some of them from the mammillary bodies up and around, and then they go back inside the brain.
So how do they know that that's what those little parts do? Just by the
Well, it took hundreds of years to figure it out. You're right. You just can't guess what they do, but especially with studying animals. And, you know, you can test frogs to see what happens when you stimulate the corpora quadrigemina. You know, you can use animal models to see what happens when you stimulate things. You can see what animals do when you remove things.
okay. That's what
But a lot of what we know, at least up until the last few years, a lot of what we know about brain function is because of patients who have lost certain parts of their brain.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, you see where their lesion was on the CAT scan,
And you see what's wrong.
and then you see what's wrong with them.
Right.
Right, so that you're working backwards. But that's the beautiful thing about neurology. You can almost always get an idea of what's going on by examining the patient.
Right.
Okay? Now, a good neurologist can almost tell you where the lesion is, okay? Because he knows all the electrical pathways, and certainly MRIs are a big help, okay?
Right.
But nowadays they're doing functional MRI, where you can actually have people do things and then see where it lights up. Okay? It's even to the point of testing what area of the brain lights up when somebody tells you a lie. You know, if you know it's a lie. Okay? And I only say that because it was interesting to me, at least, that the same area of the brain lights up when somebody tells you a lie, that lights up when you smell something bad.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, I thought that was incredible. So you have this intellectual disgust, and it sort of stimulates the same area. Okay? But you can do this with all sorts of things. You can have people imagine objects. You know, just close your eyes and imagine a nice shiny new Cadillac or something, and you can see what area of the brain lights up. Okay, so you can see where these things are working. Have somebody write something, write a paragraph, and watch what's going on in their brain, what side of the brain is working, and where when they're doing this. So that is really helpful to figure out what's going on and where. So fascinating stuff, and it's really just hundreds of papers nowadays on this kind of stuff because it's relatively new. The capability to do the functional MRI studies is relatively new. Okay, but the fornix is an interesting little thing because you're only seeing the middle of it. It's almost as if I'm sideways here and I lean over, if my body is the part you can see, the part you can't see is where the front part splits and the back part splits and curves around inside the brain. So when you cut me down the middle, the only part you really see is the part that's the middle part, because the arms are buried inside the brain and the legs are buried inside the brain. But it's important for memory connections. The ends go down into the temporal lobes, which you don't see on a sagittal view like this, because the temporal lobes are out here on the sides. Okay, so we're only looking at the middle. We're looking at facing the middle part. So this is a mid-sagittal view. The temporal lobe would be back behind this area here. And that's where a lot of your memory areas are, with the hippocampus and the amygdala, some of the emotional areas. The amygdala is associated with memory, but also with strong emotions like rage, things like that. You stimulate the amygdala in a cat, and they just, they go crazy. Okay, but it can overfire sometimes too. They think that that's part of the problem with something like post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder. The amygdala gets fired up for some reason, some emotional or traumatic thing, and it won't turn off, and it brings back the memory too quickly. In other words, we all want to avoid situations where, let's say, you walk down a street and you get beat up. Well, you're not likely to walk down that street again, okay? And if you find yourself reading a paper and by mistake walking down that street, the amygdala, you look up, the amygdala is going to go, whoa, remember what happened last time, So that's sort of healthy. It's good for you to have that sort of amygdala functioning. But if the amygdala makes too many associations, like it was a blue sky day when you got beat up, now your amygdala is telling you, it's a blue sky day, you better watch out. That's way too much, okay? And that's the problem with post-traumatic stress type of things. So, and they think they can calm that down with things like beta blockers and certain types of drugs, but yeah, when your amygdala is overreactive, that may have a lot to do with, people have a fear of driving over bridges and things like that. So, what else? I think this area right here, haven't called it, given it a name. This is called the midbrain. Okay, so we have midbrain, pons, medulla, and then spinal cord. So, that's the one. If we let this scan deeper into the brain, okay, we'll stop it at about the level of the eye, and we'll see what it looks like. Now what you're seeing is brain mass just off to the side. A lot of these are what we call association fibers that are going front to back. They're coming from your visual centers and going up to the areas that let you recognize faces and let you associate things with names. Okay, I can see this book bag. I can have certain lesions in certain parts of the brain, or I can see the book bag, but I can't tell you what the name is. Okay, anomia, I call that. You don't know the names of things, and people just tend to guess. You show them a pen and they say book, car. They don't know what it is, but they want to guess. And you can also forget how to use things. Okay.
Is that what happens with Alzheimer's? Does that part of the
Sometimes.
brain get damaged in some?
Well, Alzheimer's is such a pervasive thing
Okay.
that I'd almost have to say, yeah, it can happen in Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Because almost every area starts to atrophy, and they get a lot of eventual problems.
Okay.
Not just memory. They forget how to put their clothes on.
Yeah.
And it even affects your some of the deeper centers. They don't have the appetite. They tend to start wasting, and so yeah, it gets.
It can be it's not just.
Yeah. So it would be hard to name the lesion in Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Okay, because there's so much going on, and the brain actually atrophies. It gets smaller.
Does it?
You can see it shrink on the MRI.
Is that why they say if you exercise like puzzles and things to keep it, it's like exercising the brain so it doesn't,
Right. That's the thought. You know,
that's just a theory then, it's
well,
not.
I think it has been tested, and I think it was proven to be beneficial, but I just don't want to lie to you and say I know for sure.
Right.
Okay. But also, what I do know they found is that people who will probably never get Alzheimer's are always doing crossword puzzles, okay, or reading, or keeping their mind active.
Or learning something new.
Learning something new, they're interested in things, and travel, and all sorts of things. But a fair amount of people who actually turn out to get Alzheimer's never did that. In other words, they think Alzheimer's may actually start in your 20s. So if you're 20 years old and you never read a book, you never read the newspaper, your mind is not active, that may even be the start of Alzheimer's. Okay, we're not sure. Okay, so
it's like you use it or lose it. If
Yeah,
you're not using it and building it up, then.
I mean, I can't say that, you know, you take an Alzheimer's patient and make them read that they're going to get any better.
Right.
So I don't know if
More
it's cause and
preventative.
effect.
But that's what, I think it was at the hospital or something when my grandmother was there were some other people there in the room with her. She was getting physical therapy, but they would make her do the puzzles because after a surgery, they say it messes with your memory, something about the anesthesia and the trauma and all
It sure
of it
does,
together.
yes.
And they make her do puzzles and she hated it. But she did whatever they told her to do.
Yeah. I don't know how much of that is sort of pseudoscience at this point, but I don't doubt that
I
it's
wondered
probably
that
true.
myself, but.
Okay. So we'll.
Can't hurt.
I think
Some of
future
it makes
studies-
sense though, because like puzzles, I don't care anything about putting puzzles together, but putting puzzles where you're having to look at shapes and make them fit, and, I mean, that kind of uses your brain.
Oh, definitely, yeah, it uses the
So-
higher cognitive centers because
Yeah.
when
I've just never
you're
cared for
picturing
that.
things in 3D, okay, which is why one of the first things that tends to go with Alzheimer's patients is they lose their sense of direction because they can't picture the world in 3D. They don't know where they are. Okay, that's a very high cognitive function, along with sense of humor. Okay, that starts to go.
I'd really hate to lose that.
So those higher functioning abstract sort of things start to go. And just the ability to draw, say come up here and draw a cube in 3D, you know, that's a specific ability, and it's located in one part of the brain, and so you can have a tiny little stroke that destroys that area, and you can no longer do that, but you may do everything else fine. Okay? So it's interesting how modular the brain is. Okay? Like little areas in the in back here by the parietal lobe, by the occipital lobe here, called, like I said, called the association areas where you remember faces. Okay, you lose that, and you no longer see faces. You literally can't recognize people, even if you've met them before.
I read an article on that a lady couldn't even recognize, she had a stroke in that area, and she couldn't even recognize her kids or her husband or anything, and she like basically associated everybody like with brown hair as, you know, just that's the only thing she could, just brown hair, you know.
If they're highly functioning people, otherwise they tend to take cues, like they remember what type of ties you wear, what type of jackets you wear, that kind of thing, and that's how they recognize you, because they can't do it with the face.
Yeah.
That is really odd, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is really odd.
Because she could only remember like her sister because she had brown hair. But how many people have
If she cut her hair and wore it a different way,
Right, she wouldn't be, and she did,
That's right.
and she wasn't able to recognize
all
it.
right, you'll fool them. That's right. The saddest thing is, like for married couples, and you can actually lose not necessarily the ability to recognize faces, but that recognition is wired up to your emotional centers, to your amygdala, and to your hippocampus, and the sensory centers. And if you lose that, now you look at the face, but you don't feel like you know them. You know them, but matter of fact, if it goes far enough, they call it imposter syndrome, because people will insist that that's not my wife. You know, I mean, it looks just like her, but that's not her. You know, and because they don't feel the connection anymore. And so that's strange. Yeah. Okay. But when I talk about association fibers, this is what I mean. Fibers that are, the axons that are going front to back. That white matter, those are axons. The gray matter, this is where the cells are that do the thinking, and do the work. Okay? So anytime you see gray matter, like in the cerebellum here, that's where the nerve bodies are. When you see lighter stuff like this, that's just wiring, that's just connections. Okay? So here's a nice little eyeball. Looks like we might see one of the rectus muscles up in here somewhere, right there. A lot of neck muscles. What's that muscle likely to be right in here?
The splendus capita? No, the levator levi. The levator and.
The higher ones, probably trapezius or splenius capitis. Yeah.
That is okay.
See, they are real. you can see them on the scans. This one.
I have a question. Can cancer mess up the brain?
Oh, sure. Sure. Yeah, because you're damaging tissue, you get swelling around the tumor, and it affects all sorts of functions, and that really depends on where it is, too. What's going on? Yeah.
You know, there's a lady in my psychology class who has leukemia and she takes chemo pills, but she was doing a presentation on chemo brain,
Yeah. Yeah.
which was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think that's become a more common term recently.
They just
People
made it a IC9D something code
Yeah.
in 98. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it's, you know, it affects with memory and things like that. Okay, well, let's go to the next one here, maybe look at some labeled pictures. All right. Let's, I want to show you some labeled pictures first and go back to this one. Just to warn you, your lab test, the people that are coming tonight, you'll get your list of stuff you need to know, your word list for the brain anatomy. And what you're going to see is a PowerPoint test in lab. It'll be just like this. Okay, so we're going to have the brain, and there'll be at least 7, 8, 9 things you're going to have to label for me on this picture. Then you might get a transverse section that you have to label, maybe a coronal section. Okay, so we're looking at the brain from different ways, parts of the spinal cord, but then also I'm going to have an eyeball, and you're going to have to label the parts on the eye. I'm going to have a picture of an inner ear. You're going to have to label the parts there, so you kind of know what's coming. Okay, so once you get that list, just go for it. Okay, so but the one test slide will look just like this. You'll have a midsection, mid-sagittal section with lines, and you got to label the parts. Okay? Now, some of these are not on your list. Not all these names are. Like mesencephalon, that's not on. What that means is midbrain. Meso, middle, cephalon is head or brain. Okay, so the midbrain area right there. So again, cerebrum. Okay, and then the different lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, corpus callosum, the fornix there. Okay. Here's actually that little membrane that separates the two ventricles. That's called the septum pellucidum. Okay, you'll see it right here. Here's the little opening, the interventricular foramen. That's where fluid comes out of that ventricle and empties into this space right here. Okay. Here's the thalamus. Here's the choroid plexus. Okay. Here's the pineal gland. Here's the cerebral aqueduct where the fluid flows through. Here's the corpora quadrigemina with the superior and inferior colliculus. Collicula in Latin means hill or bump. Okay. And here's the arbor vitae, the tree of life. Okay. And cerebellum in general. The fluid is going to come out of this area is called the third ventricle. The fluid flows into the fourth ventricle, and then it flows out around the brain.
So the first and second are on the other side of the brain, or?
First and second are the lateral ventricles,
Oh.
but they don't call them first and second. They just call them the right and left lateral ventricle. Okay. So the third one is here. Here's actually the anterior cerebral artery. Okay, comes up here. You can see it folds back on itself. It gets most of the frontal lobe here that supplies blood to the frontal lobe, but it comes back far enough that it gets this area of the motor and sensory strips here. Okay, this is your motor strip where your lower body, from about your hips and legs, are going to be supplied, the motor neurons, okay? And then the sensory part is here, and you can see that the anterior cerebral artery supplies that area, which is why when you have a middle cerebral artery stroke, which gets the other side of the brain on the outside, that's where the face and upper arm is, okay? Upper arm, do you have lower arms? No, we have, that gets the face and the arms, all right? So I was telling people earlier in the class, in lab, might as well go over it again. If you have a middle cerebral artery stroke, you're getting like a hand-sized piece of your brain, but not the frontal lobe necessarily, okay? Because that's supplied by this anterior artery that goes up the middle, okay? So when I stroke this out, or block it out, I'm going to get, if I do it on the right, I'm going to get a left face paralysis and a left arm paralysis, but my left leg is probably going to be okay because it's supplied by the other artery.
Wow.
Okay? So that's the guy you see walking in the mall like this, you know, but he's walking. He's got his legs, okay? If you get them both, or you have a carotid where the carotid comes in and supplies them both, if you get them before they branch off, basically, stroke that out, you'll get them both. That's the guy that's dragging his leg too. Okay, that's this guy. You know? And he's got a walker or a cane. Okay, but he's got that side of his face is gone, right arm and his right leg may be gone. Okay, so that's clinical things that you'll see fairly often.
My mother had a stroke, and that's exactly what happened. And she had, you know, some damage to her leg as well, but the severity was mostly her arm, and, you know, and they actually, because she was swelling so quickly and so massively, they went in and they removed the dead tissue from the brain, and she had this, you know, you could tell, you know, she had the sunkenness to the front and the side of the brain and everything like that. But that's exactly what happened. She had a stroke. Was she able to walk, though, or was she just weak? Or? She was able to walk for a certain duration, and then she just got older, and then it just became harder to walk, and then she became wheelchair bound. But she never regained use of her arm. Yeah, that was a completed stroke there. Or infarct, as you call it, cerebral infarct. Anytime you cut off the blood supply to anything, you can have a kidney infarct, you call it a renal infarct, myocardial infarction, heart attack. It just means you're cutting off the blood flow and the tissue is dying because of lack of oxygen. So cerebral infarct is the medical term for stroke. And it happened in the hospital too. So it was, I mean, and you know, you think so close, you know, but just still at the time it just hits and you know, nothing. Well, it's only been in the last few years where they've really been a lot more aggressive about giving sort of blood thinners, clot breakers, you know, if you can get in the hospital, I think it's within about 3 hours, they'll give you the clot busters, just like they do for heart attacks. They give you the drugs that break the clots. So, and they've had decent results with it too, so that'll be more popular in the future, I'm sure. Just if it helps to remember the anatomy, some people think this looks like a bird, like a chicken
or a seahorse,
or a seahorse here, and then you've got the crown over here. Okay. So if you can sort of remember the parts, there's actually, I don't see it here, but there's a connection between the thalamus. Maybe it's on another one. Yeah, see that? He's even got an eyeball. Okay. And this is just another brain. Here's the anterior cerebral artery. And a carotid coming up in here. Here's the infundibulum. This is the stalk, and the pituitary gland would be hanging off that stalk right there. Okay. Here's the optic chiasm in front of it. Okay. Here's the mammillary body again. Okay. Midbrain, pineal gland, corpora quadrigemini, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, pons, medulla, thalamus, and this veiny-looking stuff, that's the choroid plexus. That's the ependymal cells that are making the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? Here's the septum pellucidum, the membrane separating the two ventricles. Corpus callosum, again, this is where all the axons are going from side to side. I think I've already said it, but when you have axons that are going front to back, we call them association fibers. When they're going side to side, we call them commissural fibers. And when they're going out of the brain or coming into the brain, we call them projection fibers. Okay. But let me explain what this eye is. Because the thalamus is embedded, we're looking at the side of the brain, the thalamus is embedded in the brain like that, okay? So when they come together real closely, you've got a fluid space in there, that's the third ventricle, that's that little space you're seeing there. But the two thalamus are really close, and they have a connection that goes from one thalamus to the other. So when you cut that connection, that's where you see the eye. Okay, you're just cutting off that connection.
It's like a little hose almost.
Like a little hose from one to another,
Okay,
right? And it's
okay.
axons going back and forth.
Okay.
Okay, so that's what makes the eye. But you can see now once you've seen a couple of brains, now you're starting to see, hey, this all kind of looks familiar. It looks like the MRI. It looks like that last picture. And so it's not as hard as you think to memorize these structures and get a feel for the anatomy. It's just like staring at the muscles. You look at it long enough, they all look the same. You know? Should we go back here for a second?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Like when they took this brain and they cut it in half, the only thing they're actually cutting is that middle part, the duct part, and the cerebellum, or?
Yeah, exactly. You've got two hemispheres to your brain. And they come up and then it dives down, okay? And it doesn't connect until you get to the corpus callosum.
Okay.
Okay? So you could take a knife and get it all the way down here before you hit anything. Okay? And then you're slicing through all of this area. You're slicing slicing the brain stem in half, and you're slicing the cerebellum in half. Okay? But you've left the brain alone because it's just sort of down like that. You're slicing it right down the middle. You'll notice when we do the sheep brain in the next lab, they don't have that big fissure. They look more, the brains are more connected. Okay? They don't have a big fissure in the middle. So, yeah, let's keep on going here. Let's see. Just another shot. Okay. So, same kind of thing, a little different coloring. Septum pellucidum, thalamus. The connection is called the massa intermedius, okay, or the thalamic adhesion. It has two names. Again, it looks like a beak of a bird. Mammillary body, infundibula, optic chiasm, midbrain, pons, medulla, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, arbor vitae. So these words will just start coming out of your mouth after a while, because they all look the same pretty much. So, this is some of the stuff that's going on deeper inside the brain. Okay, when we cut it right down through the middle, you don't see this stuff. Okay, because this is off to the side, inside the brain. Okay, this area right here, the caudate nucleus is this curvy horn-looking thing here. Okay, and the same color as these things right here. The outside of this is called putamen, and the inside is called the globus pallidus. Okay, and you can picture the way it's going to look almost if we were to slice the brain this way, right through here. Okay, we're going to take the top off, and then when we look down on it, you're going to see two round areas, one here and the other one over here. And the ventricles, the fluid ventricles, are right out here to the side of them. Okay? So those ventricles are going to be right there with the caudate nucleus right next to it. And you'll see that the fornix, that structure that was right in the middle, the other one, let's go back a second. This structure right here, the fornix, you'll see that separating the two ventricles. Okay? So let's slice that. And see, there you go. There's the fornix. Here's the septum pellucidum. It's attached to the fornix. This thing was that curvy structure going this way. Here's the head of the caudate, those two round things. The other parts of it would be curving in like this. Okay. Here's the ventricle, okay, with the fluid. Here's the putamen, and this triangular area right here is the globus pallidus. Together, these three things are called the basal ganglia. Okay? The basal ganglia. They are gray matter. They have nerve bodies. They tend to be involved with movement and memory of movement and habitual movement. once you learn how to pole vault, these kind of movements are stored, so you don't have to think about how to do it the next time.
Like riding a bike?
Riding a bike, like typing, like knitting, you know. But when these things go bad, they're responsible for a lot of movement disorders. The cerebellum, it just looks just sort of uncoordinated when you have cerebellar problems, okay? That you can't walk right, can't hold your balance right. These, the basal ganglia, cause strange disorders like writhing of the mouth and the neck and the head and turning of the hands and things like that. That's where they come from. They're called chorioathetoid movements. Okay? Sometimes they're drug side effects. A lot of the old tranquilizers that they used to give schizophrenics would cause that. It was permanent. Yeah.
What about like Tourette's syndrome? Could it have anything to do with that area?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't read about Tourette's in quite a while. But it's a good thought.
Yeah, because they have a lot of what you would
It's sort of an unconscious, you know, movement. Although it's, you know, auditory, it's voice. But I wouldn't be surprised if basal ganglia is involved. Let's put it that way. But if you want to just look at basal ganglia or movement disorders on YouTube, click on it. You'll see a bunch of them. Okay. People go there just to film themselves, showing them what kind of problems they have, and then they get together and talk, and they form websites and all sorts of things. But if you want to see some movement disorders, just like the mitochondrial diseases, you know, you look up and you can see how the people they show themselves and what kind of symptoms they have. But and occasionally you'll find an academic tape where some professor is talking about, you know, the kind of movements problems that you get. But for our purposes, I just want you to associate, you know, lesions with the basal ganglia with movement disorders. Okay, so.
Would it just be specifically due from lesions? Could it just be like maybe it didn't mature during development or something?
Well, the only way that happens that I know of is things like cerebral palsy. I don't know that there's any genetic basal ganglia problems, at least syndromes that I'm aware of.
Right.
But isn't the my mind went blank. Cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
Isn't that's not a disorder from before birth? That happens
Right.
during birth.
Right, right. It's damage to the basal ganglia at birth.
That's what that is.
Yeah.
It's damage to
Yeah. That's why they have weird movements.
Yeah.
the right.
Okay.
But that's lack of oxygen.
Yeah. Yeah. You can also get it with high bilirubin levels, as I recall.
With high what?
High bilirubin, the babies that are born with yellow skin.
Yeah.
If it gets too high, that can cause damage.
Which is
The same
jaundice.
type of damage.
Yeah, yeah, you can damage the basal ganglia. That's why they put them under the lights. That's why
Is
they try to get
that
rid
is
of
that
them.
what is damaged with the cerebral palsy? Is the basal ganglia,
A lot
or
of
is there
it.
more? Oh, there's
Yeah,
more.
well, there are many people with cerebral palsy with perfectly normal mentation. Okay, in other words, their mind is normal.
Right.
And the only problem they have is the movement and
Muscle
postural
activity.
disorder. Okay, it's because you've damaged these motor areas.
I took care of a guy who was 40 years old, and he had went to college. It took him like 6 years, or 7 or 8 years to get a 2-year or 3-year degree, but he got it in IT, but he couldn't control, like
Yeah.
you said, it was his hands. He'd have a hard time, and
Exactly.
he couldn't control his tongue just right.
Same way.
So speech
It's
was.
the basal ganglia that control the smoothness and control of the mouth, that sort of thing. So it's all related, yeah. But you don't have to have brain damage, or
I
at
started to
least-
say,
at
so
least
that
mental
accounts
damage.
for, with the lack of oxygen, did the damage to that, so there was nothing wrong with his brain. He just was not able to,
Right.
he couldn't hold a
Right,
pen.
right. If it's bad enough, you will get brain damage, or at least cognition damage. You know, because
Right.
you can damage this part of the brain out here with lack of oxygen too. But the basal ganglia just happen to be more sensitive.
That was my next question. That's the first to be damaged, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
if it's more
Yeah.
severe,
At least in my understanding.
right.
So, I'm sure somebody's going to look at their list and say, what's the insula? Okay. The insula is the area right in here. It's underneath the temporal lobe. You just sort of have to grab the temporal lobe and sort of pull it out. You can look down in there. That's the insula. That's where that area is.
Why does the brain on the right look like it's almost swollen? It looks so much different than the one on the left. It's just a different slice.
It's a different cut.
It's a different cut.
Different layer.
Okay.
I was
You
wondering
can
the
you can
same
see
thing.
the corporate quadrigemina here. You can see all 4 hills.
Okay.
Over here, you chop the toppings off.
Gotcha.
See, it's a lower cut.
Right.
Okay.
So-
I was wondering the same thing.
You can see where the fornix is starting to split too.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
You got the central part here, but now it's starting to split into the 2 arms.
Okay.
Okay. So here's just the genu. This is the front part of the corpus callosum.
Okay.
It was that big curvy white thing from the side, but now we're looking at it like this, and we just cut the head off.
Okay.
Okay, we cut the knee off, so these are the commissural fibers going from side to side.
Okay.
These are association fibers moving front to back. These fibers right in here are very important though. Okay? This is called the internal capsule. Just so you know, this is called the external capsule out here. Okay? But the internal capsule is clinically important because this is the highway for all the projection fibers going up to your motor and sensory strip. Okay? So a little stroke here is like having a wreck on I-4 and backing up everything. You know, just a little stroke here is basically going to disconnect large parts of the brain. Okay, so you can, you know, it's like turning off the water at the street. You know, you affect the whole house. Okay? And these strokes here tend to be hypertensive related, high blood pressure related. Okay, and you can get a little one, you can get one here, one here. You'll get all sorts of different symptoms. It might be face, it might be hand weakness, it might be foot
All in that one
weakness,
little area?
might be sensory.
Forgetfulness?
Yeah, but all in this little area, you're going to get all those fibers next to each other. So this is a dangerous area